The forest had taught Tessa many things about survival, but it had never taught her how to stop caring about creatures that would only cause her pain. She pulled her cloak tighter against the January dark and shifted the bundle of firewood against her hip, her boots finding the familiar grooves in the frost-hardened earth as she climbed the narrow path back toward her cabin. The pines pressed close on either side, their crowns disappearing into a sky so heavy with cloud it looked bruised, gray shading to the deep, breathless purple that came before snow. And the cold moved through her clothes like it owned them, like it had always owned them, like winter here had a particular hunger for lone women who made the mistake of stopping. She had stopped 8 months ago. She had not meant to stay. She heard him before she reached the door. A sound threaded through the underbrush to her left, low, wounded, impossibly young, and she set down the firewood before she had finished deciding to. She pushed through the thorn brush without thinking, the way she always did, the way that had cost her everything once and apparently taught her nothing at all, and found him tucked against the base of a split oak, a wolf pup no larger than a harvest basket, his fur the color of midnight smoke, dark gray shading to near black at the ridge of his spine, silver at the paws. His amber eyes were enormous and entirely too knowing for a creature his age. They found hers in the dark and held, steady, unafraid, already searching for something she could not name. There were tracks in the frost, coming from the wrong direction, away from the packed territories, away from any settlement she had mapped in her months alone. As though he had fallen from somewhere above the world and landed here, bleeding and bewildered, with no map back. "You're going to bite me." He didn't. He pressed his cold nose into the cup of her palm and made the sound again. That small, lost, completely devastating sound. And something in Tessa's chest cracked open, the way spring ice cracks, quietly, and then all at once. That had been 7 months ago. She had named him Finn because she had needed to call him something, and because his eyes had a brightness that the words seemed to fit. He had grown with a speed that startled even her, his body filling out from that small wounded thing into something vast and smoke-dark and powerful. A creature that took up half the cabin floor when he stretched in sleep, and whose head, resting against her ankle as she worked, was the size of a cooking pot. When he yawned, his teeth were the length of her fingers. When he ran beside her in the woods, the trees seemed to lean slightly away. She should have been afraid. She had never once been afraid of him. Tessa sat close to the hearth now, her needle moving through the torn hem of her skirt with the careful economy of a woman who could not afford to waste thread, and Finn lay stretched across her feet in the deep contentment of a creature that knew itself loved. His enormous paws twitched in whatever dreams wolves dream when they are safe and full and warm, and she let herself breathe in the quiet, the simple, uncomplicated warmth of the fire, the sound of the wind working through the pine tops like a long, slow sigh. She had come to Ashford's Edge with nothing. The village 3 leagues east had made their opinion of her clear enough within weeks. The woman who lived alone in the trees, who took no husband, who had appeared from somewhere south with no kin and no history and, according to old Marjorie at the market stalls, no soul worth salvaging. They had called her worse than that in the end, and she had chosen the forest silence over their noise without a second breath wasted on regret. She had Finn. She had the fire. She had the work of surviving, which was its own kind of purpose. And in the long, terrible months after she had lost everything that once gave her shape, she had learned that purpose was sometimes the only thing holding a person together. Finn's ears came up before she heard anything. He rose from sleep to alertness in a single liquid motion, silent, enormous, every muscle suddenly still beneath that smoke-dark coat, his amber eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that was not a young wolf's instinct. It was older than that. It resonated in the floorboards beneath Tessa's feet, and then the cavity of her ribs, and then some ancient part of her that did not speak in words, only in the single clear instruction: do not move. She set down the needle. Outside, the wind had stopped. That was wrong. The wind never stopped in the pines, not in January, not in the black hours before dawn. The silence that followed was absolute and purposeful, alive in the way that silence should not be able to be, a silence with weight, with something patient and enormous and entirely aware contained within it. Finn moved between her and the door. Tessa's hand found the knife at her belt, her small, human, utterly insufficient knife, and she stood slowly, her pulse loud in her own ears. The knock, when it finally came, was not what she expected. It was not desperate, not hurried. It was measured, the knock of something that had never in its long life needed to ask permission for anything, and was doing so now only as the barest courtesy before it entered regardless. 3 strikes, deliberate, final. Finn's growl dropped to a register she had never heard from him before, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Tessa crossed to the door. She lifted the latch. She opened it. And the man standing in her threshold was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. Not because of his size, though he was vast, not because of the soldiers standing motionless behind him in the dark, like a wall of iron and silence, though there were many, but because of the way his eyes moved, instantly, past her face, over her entirely, and found the wolf at her back, and went absolutely still. "Where did you get that animal?" It was not a question. She understood, in some wordless and cellular way, that stepping back would be the wrong thing to do, that this man, this immovable wall of shadow and old power filling her doorframe, would read retreat the way wolves read retreat, as confirmation of something she could not afford to confirm. So she held the door and held his gaze, and willed her heartbeat to be slower than it was, more controlled than it had any right to be, while behind her, Finn pressed himself against the backs of her knees in a gesture she had never felt from him before. He was not growling at the stranger. He was pressing against her, protecting her, from the man at the door. The man was vast in the way that things shaped by violence are vast, not merely tall but layered, built from something denser than ordinary flesh, his shoulders filling the doorframe in a way that made the cabin feel suddenly smaller, the fire suddenly dimmer. His traveling cloak was dark and road-worn, the hem of it wet from the forest floor, and beneath it she could see the hard edge of armor at his shoulder, the glint of something old and serious at his hip. His face was hewn and severe, the angles of it precise in a way that felt earned rather than given, a jaw that could have been quarried, a mouth that had forgotten softness, a scar cutting across the left side of his chin and disappearing into his collar, pale against dark stubble. His eyes were the color of ice over deep water, pale gray, almost silver, entirely without warmth. He was perhaps 30 years in appearance. He was, she understood without logic and without doubt, vastly older than that. "I asked you a question," he said. "You stated a sentence," Tessa said. There was no inflection. One of the soldiers behind him shifted, just slightly, as though the words had startled him. The man in the doorway did not shift. He did not react at all, except that something behind his ice-pale eyes moved, deep and barely visible, the way a current moves beneath still water, and she felt it more than saw it, a change in the pressure of the air between them, sudden and impossible and entirely real. "I found him," she continued, before he could speak, because speaking felt safer than silence with this man, and she did not examine that instinct too closely. 7 months ago, in the wood, a quarter league north of here. He had 3 claw marks across his flank that had gone days without care, and the temperature was dropping fast. I brought him inside. I kept him alive. That is the entirety of what happened. She watched him absorb this. He did it the way he seemed to do everything, without visible reaction, without hurry, with that enormous and slightly unnerving patience of a creature for whom time moved differently than it did for the rest of the world. Then he crouched down. It was such an unexpected thing. This vast, severe, entirely impossible man folding himself down to the cold threshold of her small cabin, that Tessa felt her breath catch before she could stop it. He held out one hand, palm upward. Not commanding, not reaching, simply open. Finn crossed to him in 3 steps. She watched Finn press his massive head into that open palm and make the sound. The same small, lost, devastating sound she had heard in the frost 7 months ago. The sound that had undone her entirely and apparently still could. And she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has survived losing things she loved, that what she was witnessing was a reunion, a recognition. Something that had believed itself severed being gently, terribly restored. Her chest ached with it in a way she had not prepared for. The man's eyes closed, one moment only, and in that one unguarded moment, she saw everything he was working very hard not to show. Then he straightened, and whatever had opened in him was closed again, precise and final. "He was lost for 7 months," he said. "We found his trail 3 days ago and tracked him to the edge of this territory. We watched from the tree line before approaching." A pause. "Every night we heard him howl, facing this direction, for hours. We believed he mourned another wolf from whatever pack had sheltered him along the way." His pale eyes held hers. He was not mourning a wolf. The silence that followed was enormous. "Then your search methods still need improvement," Tessa said. "He was a quarter league from the road." The soldier nearest the door made a sound that was immediately and aggressively suppressed. The man looked at her. Really looked. The kind of look that took inventory, that measured and catalogued and filed, that was making decisions about her without her input or consent. She had been looked at that way before, by men with power and the habit of using it, and she met it now the way she had learned to meet it. Chin level, spine straight, eyes steady. "My name is Draven," he said. She said nothing. "I am Alpha King of the Northern Territories." A pause. "The animal is of the royal line. He belongs to the keep." The word, belongs, landed in the cabin like something thrown. Tessa looked at Finn, at the wolf she had kept alive on scraps and warmth and 7 months of stubborn love, who slept across her feet and stood between her and the dark, and had only just now, for the first time, pressed against her knees in something that felt like fear. And she felt the grief come for her before she had even finished the thought, swift and precise, an old familiar blade finding an old familiar place. "I know," she said. It was the hardest 2 words she had spoken since the one she had said over a grave, 2 winters south of here, with no one to hear her. Draven studied her. Something in the way he breathed changed, barely, involuntarily, and she felt it on her skin before she understood it in her mind. A shift in the ambient quality of the air between them, as though the space separating them had acquired a texture it had not possessed a moment before. His gaze moved across her face with a precision that was almost clinical, and then stopped, and did not move on. "You will come with us," he said. Tessa blinked. "I will not." It was not a request. He looked at Finn, then back at her, and something behind his expression was doing something complex that she could not read. "He won't leave you. We watched it from the tree line. Every time he ranged outward, he returned to face this direction. He will not choose." She followed his gaze. Finn was sitting squarely between them, equidistant, perfectly still, his amber eyes moving from Draven's face to hers with the methodical calm of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "He'll adjust," Tessa said, with a conviction she did not entirely feel. Draven held her gaze for a long moment. "Every night," he said, "he howled for hours toward this place. We thought it was grief for a packmate." A pause. "It was not grief for a packmate." Tessa went very still. "He was howling for you." Outside, the wind came back all at once, a sound like the world exhaling after holding its breath for too long, and in the gust that swept through the open doorway, carrying pine and frost and the dark green scent of something wild beneath it all, something not entirely human, she understood, with the particular helplessness of a woman who had stopped once and stayed, that she had just run out of road. The keep rose from the mountain's spine like something the rock had grown rather than built. Vast, dark, permanent. Its towers disappearing into low cloud and its walls the color of old iron, stained by centuries of weather and the particular gravity of things that have witnessed too much history to pretend at innocence. Tessa had seen castles before. She had never seen one that felt like it was watching her back. The journey had taken 4 days. 4 days of riding through territories that grew wilder and colder the further north they pressed, the tree line thickening, the villages thinning, the sky lowering itself degree by degree toward the earth like a lid being drawn shut. The soldiers rode in formation around her, Not aggressively, not as a cage, but with the automatic precision of men who had been given an instruction regarding her safety and intended to follow it without interpretation. She was not sure how she felt about that. She was not sure how she felt about any of this. Draven rode ahead, always ahead, never once looking back. Finn ran alongside her horse for the first day, unwilling to ride, unwilling to be separated from her by even the length of a stirrup. By the second morning, he had accepted a position between her horse and the column, and by the third he was ranging wider, his nose working the unfamiliar territory with the focused intensity of a creature remembering rather than discovering. Old pathways reasserting themselves beneath the new ones she had carved into him over 7 months. She watched it happen and told herself it was good. She was mostly convincing. The keep's great hall was warmer than she expected and quieter than she feared. Servants moved through it with the efficient silence of long practice, and the walls were hung with tapestries that depicted hunts and battles and transformations in dark thread on dark cloth, figures mid-shift frozen in the permanent drama of their changing. Tessa kept her eyes forward and her face composed, and counted her own breaths, which was the method she had developed for surviving situations she had not chosen. A woman intercepted them before they reached the stairs. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair braided severely away from a face that had been handsome once and was now something better, authoritative, sharp, carrying the particular confidence of someone who had outlasted every challenge the world had sent her way. She looked at Tessa the way you look at something unexpected found in a familiar drawer, not hostile, but assessing, cataloging rapidly, reserving judgment with visible effort. "This is the woman?" she asked Draven. "This is Tessa," he said, flat, final, as though the question had been slightly beside the point. The woman's gaze moved to Finn, who had planted himself at Tessa's side the moment they entered the hall and showed no intention of moving. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, quickly swallowed, and beneath it, something that looked dangerously close to relief. "I'm Margot," the woman said, turning back to Tessa. "I run the keep. You'll want a room, a bath, and a meal, in whatever order you prefer." She paused. "The wolf stays with you, I assume." "He tends to make that decision himself," Tessa said, a ghost of a smile. "Yes, he always did." The room she was given was larger than her entire cabin. She did not say this aloud. She stood in the center of it after Margot left and breathed the unfamiliar smell of stone and old wood and the particular cold that inhabited large buildings, no matter how many fires burned in them, and she cataloged what she knew, which was her method for surviving the onset of panic. She was in the northern keep. She was not a prisoner. The door was not locked. She had checked twice. She was here because a wolf she had raised from a bleeding pup would not leave her, and the alpha king who owned him could not compel him otherwise. She was here because Finn needed her to be. That was enough. That had always been enough. She did not see Draven for 2 days. The keep had its own rhythms and she learned them quickly. Mealtimes, patrol changes, the hours when the great hall emptied and the hours when it filled. The particular politics of who sat where and what it meant. Margot showed her without being asked, which Tessa appreciated more than she expressed. She was given no instructions, no restrictions, no explanation for what came next, and the absence of those things should have been reassuring and was instead unsettling in the precise way that the eye of a storm is unsettling. Not because nothing is happening, but because everything is about to. On the third morning, she found Draven in the courtyard. He was alone, which she had not expected. His back was to her, his attention on the training ground below, his hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man carrying something heavy in his chest and long since accustomed to the weight. Finn was sitting 3 feet from him, watching the same nothing, in the perfect mirrored posture of a creature raised by someone who stood that way when she was thinking. Something about it stopped her breath. Draven spoke without turning. "He sits like you," he said. Tessa said nothing. "He learned it," Draven continued, "from watching you." A pause that lasted several seconds. 7 months is a long time. "It was long enough," she said carefully. He turned then and looked at her with those ice-pale eyes, and what was in them was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Not quite grief, not quite gratitude, not quite something else entirely, but living in all three places at once. What else did you teach him? She told him. Not everything. Not the nights when Finn had howled at the dark and she had pressed her forehead against his warm flank and whispered nonsense to him until they both went quiet. Not the mornings she had gone without eating so he could eat more. Not the moment she had understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like weather, that she would do absolutely anything to keep this animal safe. Those things were hers. She kept them. But she told him about the running, how she had taught Finn to stay inside the tree line, away from the road, away from the village where men sometimes came north hunting things they could sell. She told him about the commands she had used, the sounds rather than words, 2 short clicks for come and 1 long whistle for stop, because wolves responded to tone before language. She told him about the way Finn had learned to be still, which was the hardest thing, the thing that had taken weeks of patient repetition and more than one ruined afternoon. Draven listened without interrupting, without moving, with that absolute, unornamented attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he existed, fully present, nothing wasted, every word she spoke received and stored somewhere behind those pale eyes with a precision that was slightly unnerving and somehow, against all reason, made her want to keep talking. She stopped herself. That's sufficient, she said. It is, he agreed, and then, after a pause, he survived because of you. He survived because he was determined to, Tessa said. I only provided the conditions. Draven looked at her for a moment, and she felt it again, that shift in the air between them, that inexplicable textural change, as though the space separating them had grown both smaller and more charged without either of them moving. His nostrils moved, barely, involuntarily, and she watched him notice that he had done it and go very still in the particular way of someone correcting something they had not intended to reveal. She filed that away. She was not sure why. The days that followed had a rhythm she had not expected. Draven did not seek her out precisely. He was a king. His hours were consumed by councils, by the logistics of territory management, by the endless machinery of a keep that housed several hundred people and the political weight of a dozen allied clans. She understood this abstractly, observed it from the edges, stayed out of the way with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned young that invisibility was its own form of safety. But he was there, in the ways that mattered. She would come to the great hall for the morning meal and find Finn already gone from her room and trace him by instinct through 2 corridors and the side door to wherever Draven had settled for the morning. Not together exactly, but occupying the same space, with the particular ease of creatures who had known each other longer than their current estrangement. She would collect Finn and leave, and sometimes she would feel Draven's gaze at her back, steady and unreadable, until the door closed between them. Once she turned around before the door closed. He was already looking elsewhere, but the line of his jaw was too deliberate, the stillness too precise. Margot found her in the library on the 5th afternoon, a room Tessa had discovered by accident and returned to by choice, its shelves dense with the kind of accumulated knowledge that spoke of generations of people who had considered thinking worthwhile. Finn was asleep under the reading table. She had a book open that she was not entirely reading. He hasn't brought anyone to the keep, Margot said, without preamble, settling into the chair opposite as though she had been invited. Not since. She stopped, reconsidered. Not recently. He didn't bring me, Tessa said. He brought Finn. I came attached. Margot had a quality of disbelief that required no words. He asked me this morning how you were settling. Tessa turned a page she had not read. And what did you tell him? That you were adapting with alarming competence and making the library staff nervous by actually using the library. She paused. He almost smiled. Tessa said nothing. She was thinking about the courtyard, about the way he had asked, what else did you teach him, and the weight the question carried, the layers of it, and how it had not felt like a question about a wolf at all. She did not examine that thought too closely. She was still not examining it when the keep's alarm bell rang. Sharp, sudden. 3 strikes meaning a threat at the perimeter, and then a 4th meaning it was not small. And Finn was on his feet before the echo died, his fur rigid along his spine, a sound rising from him that she had never heard before. Not a growl, not a bark, a warning. Old and instinctive and directed at the northern wall with an accuracy that made her blood go cold. She was already moving when Draven appeared in the doorway, armored, his eyes finding hers across the room with an immediacy that felt like a fist closing around something vital. "Stay inside," he said, and was gone before she could answer. She stayed inside for exactly 4 minutes. Then she followed him. She told herself it was because of Finn, who had bolted through the doorway 2 seconds after Draven and could not be reasoned with when his instincts took over, which was true and also not entirely the reason. She moved through the keep's stone corridors with her hand on her knife and her ears tuned to the sounds coming through the walls. Shouting, the clash of something metal, the deep, resonant crack of timber giving way under force. The alarm bell had stopped. That was not necessarily good. Sometimes silence meant the threat had been contained. Sometimes it meant something worse had taken over. She found the northern courtyard through a door she had to break a rusted bolt to open. The scene on the other side was not what she had imagined. There were no armies, there was no siege. There was a man, one man, standing at the center of the courtyard with 6 of Draven's soldiers circling him at a careful distance, their weapons drawn, their formation tight and deliberate and going nowhere. She understood why when she looked at the man more closely. He was perhaps 40, broad and scarred, wearing the mark of a rival clan at his collar, and he held a small, limp shape against his chest with one arm. A child, a boy, perhaps 8 years old, pale and boneless and deeply, terribly still. Draven stood opposite him, unarmed, utterly motionless. "One of yours wandered," the man said. His voice carried the flat, performative calm of someone who had rehearsed this. "Found him on my territory. Thought you might want him back." He paused. "At a price." "Name it," Draven said. "The Eastern Pass. Toll rights. Your clans pay mine to cross it. Every merchant, every patrol, every wolf that moves through that corridor in either direction." He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Or the boy stays with me." The courtyard held its breath. Tessa recognized the man's clan mark, Torvin's people. She had heard them mentioned at table, a clan that had been pressing at Draven's eastern borders for 2 seasons, testing edges, withdrawing, testing again. The particular strategy of something that cannot win directly and sow chips. This was not a military action. This was a message. An insult dressed as a negotiation, designed not to be accepted but to demand a response, and whatever response Draven gave here would ripple outward for months in every direction. She watched Draven's hands at his sides, completely still. She was beginning to understand that his stillness was not blankness. It was containment, the visible surface of something massive and volatile being held at extraordinary cost. And the cost was written in the tendons of his jaw and the precise, terrible flatness of his voice. "Put the child down," he said. "When we have an agreement, put the child down." The temperature of the courtyard changed. She felt it on her skin before she understood it. A drop, swift and total, as though something vast had exhaled and the breath was winter itself. And the soldiers closest to Draven took one involuntary step back, and the man with the boy went visibly pale. Draven had not moved, not a muscle. But something had come off him like a wave, and she felt it in the deepest part of her chest. A pressure, a recognition. Something her body understood before her mind could catch up. Finn lunged past her in a streak of smoke-dark fur and planted himself between Draven and the man. 70 pounds of wolf with his lips peeled back and every hair on his spine raised to its full height, and for a moment the courtyard was entirely still. The man released the boy. It was not a decision. It was a reflex. He stumbled back 1 step and the child dropped, and a soldier was there instantly, gathering him up, moving him clear, and the man from Torvin's clan looked between the wolf and the Alpha King, with the expression of someone who had miscalculated the size of what they were standing in front of. Draven nodded once. 2 soldiers moved forward. It was over in seconds. She did not realize she had been holding her breath until it left her all at once. She leaned against the cold stone of the doorframe and watched Draven cross the courtyard toward the child. Watched him crouch down with the same unexpectedness she had seen at her cabin door. That vast, severe man folding himself small, his hand briefly and gently on the boy's head. Heard him say something too low to carry. Watched the boy nod, trembling, clutching the soldier's arm. She should have gone back inside. She was still standing in the doorway when Draven straightened and turned, and found her there with one look, the way he always found her, immediately, without searching, as though he always knew precisely where she was. And what crossed his face when he saw her was not anger at her disobedience. It was something that looked considerably more dangerous than anger. He crossed to her in long strides, and she stood her ground because she was tired of retreating, and he stopped close. Closer than he had ever stood before, close enough that she could smell him, pine and cold iron and something darker beneath it, animal and ancient and entirely overwhelming. "I told you to stay inside." "The door was unlocked," she said. His eyes held hers for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment, and something in him shifted. The shift lasted only a moment, then he stepped back, and the distance returned, and whatever had briefly opened in the space between them was closed again with the efficiency of a man who had been practicing that particular closure for a very long time. She watched him walk away and told herself the cold she felt was the courtyard and not the absence of his proximity. Told herself it convincingly, almost believed it. That night, Finn slept pressed against her back instead of at her feet, and she lay awake listening to the keep settle into its nighttime sounds and understood, with the quiet devastation of something you know before you are ready to know it, that she was in a significant amount of trouble. It was Margot who told her, 3 days later. She did not intend to. Tessa could see that, but the information came out sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else, the way truths do when they have been kept too long and find their own exits. "He had a mate," Margot said. "Just over a year ago. She died in the winter campaign. The one against the southern clans. He was with her when it happened." She was quiet for a moment. Finn was born 6 weeks after, his mate's last gift. Tessa absorbed this with the careful stillness she had learned for receiving things that hurt. "He blamed himself," Margot continued. "He still does. He believes that the bond made her a target, that loving her killed her." She looked at Tessa with the directness of a woman who had decided to be honest and committed to it fully. "He has not permitted closeness since. With anyone. He doesn't need to permit anything with me," Tessa said. "I'm only here for Finn." Margot looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She found out about Torvin's response 4 days after the courtyard. A messenger arrived at the keep at dawn, and the keep shifted into a different register immediately. That particular tightening of atmosphere that she had learned to read, the way servants moved faster and soldiers spoke lower, and the air itself seemed to compress with the weight of incoming information. She found Margot in the corridor outside the great hall, and the look on Margot's face told her most of it before the words did. "Torvin is calling it a formal grievance," Margot said. "He's claiming the clan law was violated, that his man was acting as a legitimate envoy and was detained unlawfully." She paused. "He's demanding a hearing before the Elder Council." "On what grounds?" "That Draven is unfit." Margot's voice was carefully neutral. "That the Alpha King's judgment has been compromised." She stopped. "By what?" Tessa asked. Margot looked at her, and Tessa understood. The hearing was in 2 days. She heard this from 3 separate people before noon, and she heard the rest of it, the part Margot had not said aloud, in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms and resumed at lower volumes when she left them. Torvin's formal claim named her specifically. A nameless woman of no clan, no kin, no history, brought to the royal keep at the Alpha King's command, given rooms, given access, given the company of the royal wolf. It was dressed as concern. It was an attack. By midday, she had made her decision. She found Draven in the war room, alone over maps, and he looked up when she entered with that immediate and slightly unsettling awareness she had never managed to intercept. She crossed to the table and looked at him and said it before she could find reasons not to. "I should leave," she said. "I'll take nothing. I'll go south, past Torvin's territory, somewhere his claim can't follow me. It resolves his grievance and it removes the—" She paused, chose the word deliberately. "The complication." Something in Draven's face went very still. "No," he said. "It's the logical—" "No, Draven." She said his name for the first time and felt the weight of it, the strange intimacy of it in her own mouth, and watched something respond to it in his expression that he could not entirely suppress. "I have no standing here. I am no one's mate, no one's kin, no one's anything. Torvin is using me because I am easy to use. If I am gone—" "If you are gone," he said very low, "Finn will follow you. Finn will adjust. Tessa." The word fell between them like something dropped from a great height. He had said her name. He had never said her name before, always she, always the woman, always the careful avoidance of it, and now it was in the air between them and neither of them could pretend it wasn't, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, fractured and furious, and underneath both of those things, something raw and terrible that she recognized, because she had felt it herself, when she thought Finn might not survive his first night. Fear. Not of her. For her. She opened her mouth to respond. The door opened. A soldier, pale-faced, out of breath. "My king, the Elder Council has moved the hearing. It convenes at dawn tomorrow." He hesitated. "And Torvin's men have been seen at the village, at the home of the woman who—" His eyes moved to Tessa. "They've burned the cabin, my king. Her cabin." Tessa went very still. Everything she had owned was in that cabin. Everything she had left of the life she had built before she became nobody in a forest. The last physical proof that she had existed, that she had mattered, that some small space in the world had once been hers. Gone. She turned away from both of them before either could see her face. She did not cry. She had learned, in the years that had shaped her into whatever she currently was, that crying was a luxury with a cost she could rarely afford. That it opened things in her that took too long to close again. That the world had a habit of requiring her functional at precisely the moments she most wanted to fall apart. So she stood with her back to both men and breathed, slowly and deliberately, and when she turned around, her face was composed and her voice, when it came, was level. "Tell me about the hearing," she said. Draven looked at her the way you look at something that has surprised you so completely you need a moment to recalibrate. The soldier in the doorway looked between them with visible discomfort. Draven dismissed him with one gesture and the door closed, and then it was only the two of them and the maps between them and the weight of everything neither of them was saying. "Torvin will present his grievance to the Elder Council," Draven said after a moment. "He'll argue that my judgment has been compromised, that I've introduced an unknown element into the keep without proper vetting, without clan sanction, without the council's knowledge." He paused. "It's theater. The real objective is to force a public conversation about the succession, about Finn." Tessa looked up. "What about Finn?" "He has no Luna." Draven's voice was flat and careful. "The royal wolf requires a bonded pair to anchor the line. Without a mate, the succession is technically challengeable. Torvin knows this. He's been building toward it for 2 seasons. His eyes moved to hers. "Your arrival gave him a new angle." "Because you brought a woman of unknown origin into the keep." "Because Finn chose you," Draven said. "That is not a small thing. The Elder Council will understand what it means. Torvin is counting on that." Tessa was quiet for a moment, working through the architecture of it. She had always been good at this, at seeing the shape of a problem, the load-bearing points of it, where it could be challenged and where it could not. It was the skill that had kept her alive through things she did not talk about. It was useful now in the way a tool is useful, cold and precise and entirely separate from feeling. "What does it mean?" she asked. "Finn choosing me." Draven was quiet for too long. "It means," he said finally, "that his wolf recognizes something in you." He looked away from her, toward the dark window, his jaw set in the way she now knew meant he was navigating something internal at significant cost. Wolves do not choose caregivers arbitrarily, especially not royal wolves. The bond they form responds to a particular kind of... He stopped. "Draven." He turned back to her. "It responds to someone who carries the blood," he said. Distantly, faintly, enough that his instincts recognized it where no one else could. A pause. "You are not fully human, Tessa. You have never been fully human." The war room went very quiet. She had known this, she realized, in the way you know things you have refused to name, had known it in the instincts that were too precise, in the way animals had always trusted her without reason, in the way the forest had always felt less like a place she inhabited and more like a place she belonged to. She had known it in the blood of her mother, who had died without explaining herself, and in the blood of her grandmother, who had explained too much in riddles that only made sense now, here, in a castle at the edge of the known world with a royal wolf and a king who wouldn't look at her. "What am I?" she asked. "A dormant line," he said. "Old, almost extinct. Shifter blood so diluted it never activated. Probably never would have, under ordinary circumstances." He paused. But Finn found it. He knew. "He always knew," she said. She went to Finn that night and sat on the floor of her room with her back against the bed and his great head in her lap, and she thought for a long time about the hearing that was coming, and what it would mean, and what she was prepared to do about it. Outside, the wind moved through the keep's high stones with a sound like something ancient breathing. The fire burned low. She thought about the cabin, about watching the last physical remnant of her old life burn from a second-hand account in a war room, about the fact that she was not surprised, that some part of her had always understood she was not meant to remain small, not meant to stay invisible, not meant to survive at the edges of other people's worlds without a self to return to. She thought about Draven's face when he'd said her name. She thought about fear that is not of but for. "I know," she told Finn. He pressed closer. She let him. By the time the fire burned out, she had made a decision that was entirely different from the one she had made in the war room. She was not going to disappear. She was not going to make herself easy to dismiss, easy to erase, easy to burn. Tomorrow, at the hearing, she would walk in on her own terms, and for that she needed to speak to Draven tonight. She stood. She crossed to the door. She opened it. He was already in the corridor, his hand raised to knock. They stood in the doorway, and neither of them spoke. His hand was still raised, that suspended gesture, knuckles that had not yet met wood, caught in the moment between intention and action, and her hand was still on the latch, and the corridor was dark except for the low burn of the wall torch behind him, that made his shadow stretch long toward her and did not illuminate his face so much as suggest it, the severe line of the jaw, the pale eyes finding hers with their usual, immediate, slightly disorienting accuracy. He lowered his hand. She stepped back. He entered. She did not examine how natural that sequence had felt. The room was dark except for embers, and for a moment neither of them moved to correct that, and she was aware of him in the dimness with a precision that had nothing to do with sight, the density of him, the warmth that came off him in a wave that she felt before he was fully inside the room, that particular scent beneath the cold of the corridor, pine and old iron, and the dark animal thing underneath, the thing she had first caught in the wind on her doorstep and had been trying not to think about since. Finn lifted his head from the floor, looked at Draven, put his head back down, a vote of confidence from the wolf. Under other circumstances, she might have found it amusing. "I was coming to tell you something," Draven said. "So was I," Tessa said, a pause. He gestured. after you. And she understood it as the courtesy it was, which meant she understood he was capable of courtesy, which was somehow the most disorienting thing she had learned about him yet. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. "I know that was what I said before. I was wrong. I won't give Torvin the satisfaction of making myself easy to erase. Not after—" She stopped, breathed. "Not after the cabin. I'll stand in front of his council and I'll answer every question they have, and I'll do it on my feet. And if my presence is an inconvenience, then it is an inconvenience they will have to tolerate." The silence that followed was long and had a quality she could not immediately name. "Good," Draven said. She blinked. "That's all?" "I came to ask you to do exactly that." He moved to the window, not restless. Nothing about him was ever restless, but with the deliberate repositioning of a man who needed a specific distance to say what he was about to say. The council responds to presence, to certainty. If you walk in uncertain of what you are, they will decide for you. He paused. If you walk in knowing, they cannot touch you. "I only learned what I am a few hours ago," Tessa said. "I know." He turned from the window and looked at her. "I should have told you sooner. I knew from the second day. Margot recognized the signs and I confirmed them. I did not tell you because—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "I was not certain how to tell you, or what it would mean, or what you would do with it." "You thought I'd leave," she said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. She crossed her arms and looked at him in the low ember light and thought about all the things she had been in the past 2 years, fugitive, ghost, woman at the edge of the trees, and thought about the dormant blood in her veins that a royal wolf had recognized when no human ever had, and thought about how long she had been surviving instead of living, and how the two things were not remotely the same. "Tell me what to say tomorrow," she said. "Tell the truth," he said. "All of it. Where you came from, what you survived, how you found Finn. The council is old, and it is many things, but it does not punish honesty." A pause. "Torvin is counting on your silence, on your shame. He believes you have something to hide because everyone who comes from nowhere is hiding something, in his experience." His eyes held hers. "Give him nothing to work with." "And if they ask about you?" she asked. "About why I'm here, about what I am to the keep." The air between them did something complicated. He crossed the room, not quickly. Nothing he did was quick. Everything was deliberate, chosen, and stopped before her, close in the way he had been close in the courtyard, close enough that the warmth of him reached her before he did, and she held herself very still, because stillness was the only thing she trusted herself with right now. With his face at this distance and his scent surrounding her and Finn breathing quietly behind them both like a benediction. "Tell them," he said, "that you are under my protection." "Is that what I am?" His gaze moved across her face with that precise, unhurried attention, and landed on her eyes and stayed. "No," he said, very quietly. "But it is what I am prepared to say in front of a council." Something in her chest turned over, slow and total, like the first warm stone of spring beneath cold water. "My king," a soldier's voice from the corridor. "Torvin's men, the ones seen at the perimeter earlier, have been detained and disarmed. All 4 of them, no injuries." Draven did not look away from her. "Good, hold them until after the hearing." The footsteps retreated down the corridor. The silence that returned was different from the one before, softer somehow. The last obstacle cleared, nothing left between them but the ember light and the small distance that remained and the enormous weight of everything neither of them had said yet. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Get some rest," he said finally. "Tomorrow you walk in knowing exactly what you are." He turned toward the door. "Draven," he stopped. "What are you prepared to say?" she asked. "When the council asks what I am to you." He stood with his back to her for one long, still moment, and left without answering. But at the door, just before it closed, she saw his hand tighten once on the frame. The Elder Council convened at dawn in the great hall's upper chamber, 7 figures arranged in a stone arc, their faces carrying the accumulated weight of centuries, their eyes moving over everything with the patient assessment of people who had seen too many crises to mistake theater for substance. Torvin stood to the left, flanked by 2 men from his clan, wearing the particular satisfaction of someone who believed they had already won. Tessa walked in behind Draven and did not look at the floor. Torvin's grievance took 20 minutes to present and was, as Draven had predicted, a work of careful theater. Each word chosen for maximum implication with minimum provable accusation. The unknown woman. The compromised judgment. The royal wolf's inappropriate attachment. The succession question dressed in the language of concern, of tradition, of deep and abiding respect for the old ways that Torvin clearly felt applied to everyone but himself. She listened to all of it. She kept her hands loose at her sides. Finn sat between her and Draven and was very still. When Torvin finished, the eldest of the council, a woman with white hair and eyes the color of deep amber, turned to Tessa. "Speak," she said. So Tessa spoke. She told them everything. She had decided in the hour before dawn, lying awake in the dark with Finn against her side, that the only thing she had which Torvin could not burn was the truth, unembellished, undefended, simply stated in the flattest and most accurate terms she possessed. So she told them where she had come from, a village 2 days south of Ashford, where she had been born to a woman who died young and a grandmother who spoke in riddles. She told them about the years after, the work she had taken, the people who had used her, and the ones who had tried to. The slow accumulation of losses that had eventually deposited her at the edge of a forest with nothing and no one. She told them about the January night, the frost, the bleeding pup, the 3 claw marks. She watched the eldest council member's eyes change as she spoke, something moving in them, a recognition, a sharpening. "I kept him alive," Tessa said, "because he needed someone to. I stayed because he needed me to stay. I came here because he would not leave without me, and I would not let him be torn between 2 places out of my own stubbornness." She paused. "I have no clan claim, no political interest, no agenda that extends beyond the welfare of a wolf I raised from a pup and love without reservation." She looked at Torvin directly. "You burned my cabin. That was everything I owned. I am standing here anyway." Torvin's expression had shifted during her account, the satisfaction bleeding out of it degree by degree, replaced by something recalculating, something looking for the angle it had missed. "The question of her blood," he started, "has been assessed," the eldest council member said. She had not looked away from Tessa. "The dormant line she carries is recorded in the oldest registers of this council, a lineage we believed lost 2 generations past." Her amber eyes settled on Tessa with something that was not quite surprise and not quite its absence. "We did not expect to see it walking through that door." Torvin stepped forward. "Regardless of her blood, the king has made no formal. I claim her." Draven's voice had not been loud. It had not needed to be. It fell into the chamber the way a stone falls into still water, and the silence that followed was the silence of that impact, spreading outward, total and irreversible. He stepped forward, and she felt him beside her, the warmth of him, the density, and she did not turn to look at him because she was afraid of what would happen to her composure if she did. "Before this council," he said, "under the old law, I claim Tessa of the dormant line as mate, and Luna of the Northern Territories." She turned then. She could not help it. His eyes were on her, only on her, the council and Torvin and the entire chamber rendered peripheral, and what was in them was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. All the vault doors open, everything he had been containing for a year, and every careful, controlled day in between, looking at her with the full force of it, and it was enormous, and it was terrifying, and it was the most certain thing she had ever been looked at with in her life. "If you'll have me," he said. Behind them, Torvin made a sound of protest that no one acknowledged. She thought about the cabin in the frost, about the first morning she had woken with Finn across her feet and understood she was no longer entirely alone, about all the things she had survived by making herself small and invisible and easy to overlook, and how none of those things had protected her, and how the only thing that had ever actually kept her safe was the stubborn insistence of her own care, for a wolf, for herself, for whatever life she could make from nothing. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against his chest. He went absolutely still beneath her hand. She felt his heartbeat, steady, enormous, deliberate. "Yes," she said.
Oh!
The bond came like the first breath after drowning, not violent, not the cataclysm she might have expected, but vast, a warmth that began where her palm met his chest and spread outward through every part of her she had kept cold for years, filling old spaces she had forgotten were empty. And she heard him exhale, one short, involuntary breath, and watched his eyes close, and felt through the new living thing between them exactly what this cost him and exactly what it gave him, and understood that they were, in this moment, perfectly matched. Finn threw his head back.
Ow!
Parte 9 de 10. Part 10 of 10. The New World. Spring came to the northern keep, the way it always came to places that had endured long winters, not gently, not gradually, but all at once, as though the cold had simply decided it had made its point and withdrawn, leaving behind mud and snowmelt and the particular green of new growth that seems almost aggressive after months of gray, pushing through stone cracks and old soil with the cheerful indifference of life that does not ask permission. Tessa stood at the window of the high room that was now hers, that was now theirs, and watched the courtyard fill with the morning's first activity, and breathed in the smell of thawed earth and pine, and the faint distant smoke of the village waking, and thought about all the windows she had stood at in her life, and how none of them had ever felt like this one. Behind her, Draven was still asleep. This was remarkable in itself. She had learned in the weeks since the hearing that he slept lightly and briefly, the way predators sleep, always partially attending, always ready to surface, and the fact that he slept deeply in her presence was something Margot had told her, with great precision and visible satisfaction, had not happened in a year. She had filed that piece of information in the same place she filed all the things about him that undid her. The way he reached for her hand in the dark without waking, the way his voice changed when he spoke to her in the hours before dawn, the way he looked at Finn when he thought no one was watching, with a grief that was slowly and visibly becoming something else. Something that looked like peace. Torvin's formal challenge had collapsed within a week of the hearing. The Elder Council's recognition of Tessa's blood, the dormant line, ancient and recorded, had stripped his argument of its foundation, and the clan leaders who had been cautiously aligned with his cause had withdrawn with the swift pragmatism of people who understood which direction the wind had turned. He had retreated to his eastern territories and was, according to the last report, being extremely quiet, which Draven said was either good news or the kind of news that arrived later wearing a different face. She had told him she was not afraid of later. He had looked at her for a long moment and then said very low that he knew. That this was one of the things that terrified him. She had laughed, genuinely, fully, and watched something happen in his expression that Margot later told her she had never seen before. He had laughed too. Finn appeared at the window ledge from outside, impossibly, given that they were on the second floor, but he had developed a route involving the old oak's nearest branch that he used with the satisfied regularity of someone who had solved a problem and intended to use the solution indefinitely. He pushed his great head through the gap she had left and looked at her with those amber eyes, ancient and knowing and entirely smug. "Good morning," she told him. He made the sound, not the small, lost, wounded sound from the frost. That sound was gone, she realized, had been gone since the night of the hearing, retired into the past where it belonged. This was different, deeper, a sound of settlement, of a creature that had found its place and intended to remain in it. She pressed her forehead briefly against his. "I know," she said. The warmth of the bond moved through her as it always did when she acknowledged it, that vast, quiet thing that had taken up residence in the architecture of her chest, different from what she had expected. Nothing like the violent, consuming force the old stories described. It was more like weather, like belonging. The way a key belongs to its lock, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the absolute certainty of fit, a certainty that asked nothing of her and gave her everything. She felt Draven wake behind her, felt it through the bond before she heard him move, a shift in the quality of his presence, a rising warmth, and then his voice, roughened from sleep. "You're at the window." The courtyard is interesting in the morning. A pause, the sound of him crossing the room, then his hands settled on her shoulders from behind, carefully, as he always touched her, with the particular deliberateness of a man for whom touch had been a closed country for a year, and who was learning its geography again one careful step at a time. And he looked over her head at the courtyard below, and she felt his breath against her hair. "What do you see?" She looked at the courtyard, at the soldiers running the morning drills, at Margot crossing toward the kitchens with her iron-gray braid and her air of absolute authority, at the sky above the northern wall, pale blue and enormous, the kind of sky that only existed in places far enough from everything else to have room for it. At Finn, dropping from the window ledge to the courtyard below in a single fluid arc, scattering 3 soldiers and landing in a patch of new spring mud with evident delight. She felt Draven's chest shake against her back. She reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. "Everything," she said. Outside, the wolf ran through the new green morning, and the world was wide, and it was theirs.